The Extraordinary Phenomenon Investigations Council presents Epic Voyages. Come join us as we enter and experience the great mysteries of the world with tonight's host,
Lyle Blackburn.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Epic Voyages. I'm Lyle Blackburn, your host this evening. Sit back and enjoy as we enter the world of the unexplained and mysterious with my guest, David Weatherly, author of The Black-Eyed Children. David Weatherly is a longtime paranormal investigator. For over 35 years, he has explored the world of the strange, investigating cases around the country and abroad. He has written and lectured on a diverse range of topics, including cryptozoology, UFOs, and hauntings. David has also studied shamanic and magical traditions with the elders from numerous cultures, including Europe, Tibet, Native America, and Africa. He has appeared on numerous radio programs, including Dreamland, Veritas, Project White Paper, Haunted South, Darkness Radio, and now, of course, Epic Voyages. He has written for numerous magazines and is the author of The Black-Eyed Children, which will be the subject of our discussion this evening. Welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight, David.
Hey, wow. Thanks for having me on.
You bet. This is my first time as a radio host. Usually I'm on the other end of the spectrum, so this will be a good experience, though, because I've read your book, and it's really one of the most interesting books I've read in quite some time, and it's kind of a cool story on how I came to meet you and how the subject of the book was brought up. I mean, I guess you remember when we were at that Bigfoot meeting at an undisclosed location in Texas, right?
Sure.
And so we're there talking Bigfoot, and I had seen David around, and we got to talking, and we happened to be standing in the doorway of this establishment, and David mentioned, I'm writing a book, and we started talking about books we were writing, and he said, mine's on the subject of the phenomenon called Black-Eyed Children, or BEK's Black-Eyed Kids, and he asked if I'd ever heard that, and I said no, and so he proceeded to tell me what this was all about, and it really gave me chills at the time, and the fact that we were standing by a doorway, an entrance to a home, which plays heavily into the subject of his book. It was just the perfect setting, so that kind of piqued my interest, and of course, when our books came out, I got a copy and read it, and so that's one reason I really wanted to have David on the program to share some of his findings in the Black-Eyed Children case and to talk about his book, because I think everybody will find it very interesting. So let me throw it back at you, and you just tell everybody a little bit about what the Black-Eyed Children are.
Sure. It's it's a really weird phenomena that has come more into the limelight in the last few years. It originally, on the surface, seems to have started in the late 90s, the early days of the Internet, when a couple of stories were posted about encounters with these kids. But through researching my book, as I began to explore it, I found out that the phenomena had actually been around much longer than that, just under some different names. And what this entails is these children that, or at least they appear to be children, they show up at people's doorsteps. They show up at hotel rooms. They approach cars and parking lots. And they usually average between the ages of 8 and 13 years of age. They have very pale skin. They're usually attired in drab colored clothing. Sometimes it's described as looking homemade, or some people use the term that it looks like Amish clothing. So there's something a little bit off, initially, even with these kids. And as the encounter unfolds, the person who's dealing with these kids realizes at some point that these children have solid black eyes. And we're not talking about just the pupils. The entire sclera is black. And what happens is that very often when the kids initially approach, they'll have their heads tilted down, or they won't be looking directly at the person. So it happens during the encounter that these kids at some point will look up and make eye contact, and that's when the person realizes, my God, these kids have solid black eyes. Along with those things occurring, the person encountering the children goes pretty rapidly from, I found there's about 3 stages of it. First is just an uneasiness that something is not quite right, because these kids just aren't acting like normal children would. That uneasiness rapidly goes to outright nervous, antsy feeling, and then it escalates very quickly to fear. The people who are victims of these encounters almost always end up running away from the kids, slamming the door. If they're in a car, they'll drive away. They just want to do anything they can to get away from these children.
So how do these usually initiate these encounters? Is it a knock at the door? Do they ever ring the doorbell? I mean, how does it start?
That's one of the weird things, Lyle, is that they don't use doorbells for some reason. Most all of these encounters, a typical encounter, for instance, in a house, I like to use one that's in my book from a gentleman named Paul. And Paul is actually the person who sort of initiated my exploring this particular phenomena, because when I met him, I had heard some of the black-eyed kids' stories just from the internet, but it was right there in that range of, well, they could be urban legend, they're weird stories and it's intriguing, but, I just don't know. And then I met this gentleman named Paul, who was a complete skeptic about anything paranormal, but he was also one of those people that couldn't leave the topic alone. He's always cracking jokes about it, and, he was kind of a John Wayne character, bodybuilder, martial artist, well over 6 feet tall. He's worked as a prison guard. And Paul's story was that he got home from work one day and was in the kitchen, making himself a sandwich or something, and he hears this long, continuous knock. And just like anyone would do, he kind of paused, and it puzzled him initially. What is that noise? Is that somebody knocking at the door? Why aren't they using the doorbell? All the logical things that any of us would go through. And, he stood there for a second and realized, no, it's someone knocking on the front door. And he went to the front door and opened it, and sure enough, here are these 2 boys standing on his steps, their heads tilted down slightly. And, the encounter that ensued was very typical of these black-eyed child encounters. These 2 boys, they're looking down, and when Paul opened the door, the first thing they said was, "Hey, we just thought we'd stop in for a bit." And Paul's this real no BS guy. He's kind of thinking, what is this? He kind of looks at them for a minute and says, I think you guys got the wrong house. And, the response is very cold, well, we'll just come in anyway.
Oh, creepy.
And it's very creepy, and this is typical of these encounters. Most people say that the children speak in a very monotone manner, that they repeat phrases. A lot of people feel like these kids have memorized a certain number of phrases. If you try to ask them direct questions, they simply repeat something they've already said. And what they do is they try to get you to invite them in your home. So they'll say things, like, just invite us in. This won't take long. So, the whole thing, we hear these stories and they're extremely creepy. And, Paul's encounter, as I said, was very typical of these black-eyed kids. They proceeded to repeat these phrases to him, and he went from being a little bit uneasy to being very nervous, and he finally slammed the door on them, stood against the door for a moment, walked across his room into his living room, and he's standing there in the middle of the living room, and he hears this long rapping. He turns around, and his front door was one of those with the glass frame around, the panes of glass around the outside of it, framing the door. And when he turned around, there appearing in one of those frames is the face of one of these kids just staring into the room and looking at him and tapping.
Wow.
And that's what kind of put Paul over the edge. He said that he felt like he went from terror to anger in a few seconds, and he ran into his bedroom. He retrieved his firearm. He came running back out. He told me the only thing he could think of in those few seconds was that he wanted to scare those kids like they had just scared him. So in those few seconds it took him to run in and retrieve that gun and come out, yank the door open. There's nothing. There are no children. He searched the yard, the driveway, the street. He asked neighbors. There was no sign of these kids anywhere. They had completely vanished. And that also is one of the staples of these encounters.
Right. Yeah, that's it's interesting that, you point out the anatomy of Paul, that he's a martial artist and a bodybuilder, because that's significant, as you point out, the fear reaction that a guy like this got from kids. What kid could scare a guy like that? So it seems like an important, definitely an important part of that story. How did you end up running into Paul? I mean, how did that? You said you had previously seen some of these stories on the internet. How did it go from that to meeting somebody? Was it totally by chance, or were you actually pursuing information on this subject?
Well, yes and no. I'm a martial artist myself, so he actually trained at a dojo where I taught, and he, I didn't make any secret about the fact that I actively pursued anything paranormal, and people would ask me questions all the time, and people approach you all the time. So like I said, this guy, on occasion he would always make jokes or cracks about it. Oh, you catch any, big feet today, or see any flying saucers and things like that. And being involved with the paranormal for so many years, you learn that these people kind of find their way into your circles that seem to be skeptics on the outside, but they can't leave the topic alone. And,
right.
That often says to me, and that was, when I met this guy, I realized pretty quickly, okay, this guy says he's a skeptic, but yet he can't leave it alone. So he's got something that nags at him, some story that nags at him. And indeed, that is, what occurred. And he caught me one day having lunch and asked if he could join me. He sat down, and, that was it. He just kind of opened up. He started asking me questions. He said, you pursue these things very seriously, don't you? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. And we just talked about some things in general, and he finally got around to the fact that he had this encounter that had happened to him that had nagged him for a long time. And he actually is a very interesting person. I'm still in contact with him and speak to him occasionally, and he's never really gotten past this encounter. He invested a lot of time and energy after encountering these kids to try to come to terms with feeling fear, because this guy, he worked as a prison guard for years, and he'd been in the middle of brawls, he'd seen people shanked in front of him, just the worst of the worst in terms of what society has to offer. So it was completely alien to him to encounter something that terrified him, let alone in the form of a couple of kids. So, it was something that he still wrestles with to this day, trying to come to terms with what produced that reaction. And that's one of the big questions about these encounters. We just don't know. It seems to be similar to maybe a reaction that people would feel from infrasound. But, it's really difficult to tell. Something else is going on in these encounters that is producing this level of fear within people. And it's extremely difficult to rationalize that. I mean, we can sit back and hear these stories or even visualize these stories and think, man, that's really creepy. I would be creeped out, but to think about it in terms of being outright, completely frightened. I get people asking me all the time, why would someone be frightened of a couple of kids? And, there's just a lot of aspects to it we don't understand. And I think there's also a psychological aspect that comes in. Whenever you mix children and the paranormal, it creates a different set of circumstances, and it causes a different reaction because, as adults, we're sort of hardwired to help kids. And, if a kid shows up and they need a drink of water, or they need to use the phone, or they need to come in for some reason, the logical mind thinks, this is a kid, I need to help them. But there's something else, energetically going on that's creating a conflict there in these situations. And it's extremely difficult for people to come to terms with.
Yeah. Certainly. I mean, I think that's probably why there's been a lot of successful, scary horror movies that involve kids, The Omen or things like The Bad Seed. You don't you do not expect this for children. They catch you off guard. And, that's probably why this guy, Paul, is still wrestling with this, because I'm sure in his a man's ego, you're shocked at yourself or disappointed or whatever that you would have such a reaction to a couple of kids knocking on the door. So yeah, that's definitely interesting. So, just to put this in a perspective of timeline, how this parlayed into the book, did you already have the idea to write the book at this time, or did this story and meeting with Paul kind of propel you further to research and write the book?
Oddly enough, it wasn't either one of those things exactly. What happened, I met Paul in the early 2000s, and, at the time I was very actively investigating a lot of different aspects of the paranormal, and I would pursue different things. But I wasn't writing any books at the time. What happened was a few years later, I finally decided, okay, I'll start going through some of this massive number of case files and some of these different things I'm interested in, and put some books out. And I started writing a book initially that was a study that encompassed a lot of these weird beings that show up, sort of out of nowhere. The black-eyed children, the grinning man, skinwalkers, which are well known in the southwest of the U.S. So just some of these very odd paranormal type of beings that would show up and affect some kind of reaction or change or different things in people's lives. And that was the book I was originally working on, something that encompassed a bunch of different creatures. And what happened was I was asked to do a radio show, and they asked me to come on and specifically talk about just the black-eyed kids. I was like, oh, okay, I've got enough knowledge and material about them to do that. And I went on and did the hour and a half, whatever it was. And afterwards I was inundated, with people sending me emails and messages and saying, I had no idea anyone else had ever seen one of these things. I've had this encounter, or my sister's had an encounter. Will you talk to her? And, it just sort of boomed from there. It was like all of a sudden I realized, wow, this is a lot more widespread even than I initially realized. And I had already had a number of accounts from, places all over the country and some overseas, but, I suddenly realized that people really wanted to know more about this and explore this. So I sort of shifted my focus and, took just the material on the black-eyed children out, and realized, wow, there is enough here really for a book, and explored it that way. So that's how the book itself came about.
Right. And that often results in really good books, because you let the phenomenon guide you along. You saw that people were interested in it, and you followed through with it, whereas it wasn't something you said, well, I'm going to write a book on this, and I'm going to take 3 months to do it. It just sort of developed out of that, because and it's cool because I, as a fan of the book or whatever, I tell people about this, and it's like a lot of people haven't heard of it, or they've heard a little bit of it, and it's cool that now you can say, well, here, if you're interested in that, or you want a really interesting book, go check this out, and there's the book, and you've taken the time and researched this very thoroughly and put it all together. So, another aspect to this, which develops out of the book, is that the children are not necessarily knocking on doors. Sometimes people have encountered them trying to get into their car. Could you give us an example of one of those cases?
Yeah, there's a lot of those, actually. And a typical case will be someone, well, actually, we can go back to sort of the modern beginnings of this phenomenon. The first story, and probably the most well-known story of the black-eyed kids, was posted in, I think, 1998 on the internet in early days of, like forums. And it was from a gentleman in Texas named Brian Bethel, who's a journalist. And his story was that he went to pay a bill, and the place he was going was in a strip center. He went over there this, one evening in his car. He's sitting in his car writing a check out, and these two kids approached his car and sort of tapped on the driver's window. And, he was initially very cautious. He just felt, he just had an odd vibe from these kids even approaching him. And as a result, he put his window down just a little bit, and these kids, they're trying to act normal, and they're saying things like, hey, mister, we left our money at home. Can you give us a ride? And, he's sort of puzzled, and he's looking around. There's no one else around. These kids are trying to convince him. They're saying things like, well, we want to see the movie, this movie, and we left our money at home. Well, Bethel had the consciousness to look up at the movie marquee and realize the movie they wanted to see was like 2/3 over or something. So it just didn't make sense. Things weren't adding up. He didn't know what was going on. He's looking at these kids, and they're saying things like, don't worry about it, we're just kids. And as this exchange is happening, he looks up and he realizes their eyes are solid black. And, Bethel quickly put his window up and drove away, leaving these kids sort of standing there in the parking lot, and, they're just sort of staring at him drive away. But that kind of is a typical encounter. There have been a lot of accounts that have come in from people, in shopping areas. They'll be at a Target store, and they'll be sitting in the parking lot getting ready to get out of their car, or they will have just gotten into their car, and these kids will show up at the window, and they'll ask for a ride. Just tell me to get in your car and drop me off at home. Strange things like this. So it really is. There's something else about these encounters that it's almost like they find the particular people they want, because there doesn't seem to be any boundaries as far as where or when they'll show up. I mean, they'll show up at people's places of business. There's a weird story about them showing up at a convenience store after hours and knocking on the glass doors until someone finally comes to the door. And, the girl who had locked everything down, she's in the back and she's thinking, that it's so, every once in a while somebody will think we're still open because the lights are on, or they'll, or it's just a drunk or something like that. And this knocking wouldn't go away. The girl finally goes to the door, and the comment from this kid is, "We want to shop." Open the door and tell us we can shop. So, we get these encounters that the language is just not quite right. It just doesn't fit. It doesn't add up. And, I like the fact that, someone said to me, I've had more than one person say, these kids, given their age range, most kids that age really aren't overly anxious to talk to adults, let alone to approach them for things like this. So it's kind of unusual from that aspect too.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting point, because some of the behavior described, they're kind of looking down, or they're not overly animated. That kind of seems like a shy kid, yet,
right.
They are approaching strangers and asking. So, yeah, it's another thing that just doesn't add up. And, you mentioned earlier in the description that oftentimes they're dressed in outdated clothing or drab clothing. I found it interesting that those kind of descriptions almost give you this visual of kind of like a ghost or something ghostly, because, you typically associate ghosts with period costumes or dress and things like that. So, but then on the other hand, some of these children were dressed in like dark hoodies, things like this, which would be more of a modern look. How do you figure that there's not really a consistency in the way they're dressed?
That's kind of weird. That's one of the, all of this is weird. But,
yeah, it's another weird thing.
Yeah,